Hello class, good afternoon. This is Dr. Dilmar and we are ready to jump into our psychology lesson for this afternoon. Today we are looking at and exploring operant conditioning as opposed to our last lesson of classical conditioning. So what do you need to have to be prepared for tonight's lesson? The first thing you need to have is your computer, so you're logged into your course. So if you're not logged in actively into the course, please do that. And then you also need to have something to jot down some notes, questions, or reflections with. And so you may do that electronically, or if it's more convenient, since you're probably managing multiple tabs on your computer, if it's more convenient to do that pen and paper, certainly acceptable. It's just that I do ask you to make some connections as we're working and jot down any questions that you might have. And I'll stop about 10 or 15 minutes in to answer any questions. And at the end of the lesson, we'll do some reflections and sharing. But what is all this reflecting and sharing on tonight? It is on operant conditioning. And that's a fancy way to say we are going to be looking at shaping behavior. So operant conditioning is a learning theory that uses punishment and reinforcement to understand how behavior is shaped. Now, before we jump in, I always outline this ahead of time, and you should have that there in your course, that I'm asking you to make connections and reflect on how you might utilize these concepts in the future, and then we'll journal how you might affect change and promote those desired outcomes in the future. The beautiful thing is that with shaping behavior, this is so highly relevant to everything that you do that I think the connections tonight and the reflections will come easy for you. And in fact, there might be some excitement where you can think about how you might use these concepts in the future, whether it be at work, home, or school. The exciting part about this for me is that when people always say, oh, you're using psychology on me, you're trying to shape me to do something you want me to do, well, this is the true essence of that saying. And some of you are probably going to get to see how you've done this already in the past and didn't even know it, and or maybe somebody was doing it to you. Maybe they were shaping your behavior and you didn't even realize they were using the concepts of psychology. So strong connections tonight that I think will flow easily. And this is what you'll be journaling as we write. So you've got your pen and paper or your computer open, and you'll be making those connections, and we'll share them out at the end. Now, as I said before, we looked at classical conditioning, but tonight we're looking at operant conditioning. So the difference here is that the learning is in which reinforcement is contingent upon the subject's behavior. So this is about learning and behavior where the reinforcement is contingent upon the behavior. So the subject or the person whose behavior is being shaped, that's the leading driving factor. Before we got into the lesson tonight, yesterday when we ended, I did ask you guys to review Skinner's box and these four vocabulary words or terminologies, because this helps you to understand tonight's lesson. And so if you've already read about reinforcers and punishment, that will help set you up for tonight. As well as Skinner's box, that's going to be the next homework assignment. But often I find that it's helpful to read about Skinner's box, then we do the lesson, and then you'll go back to Skinner's box and you'll be able to look at and understand the concepts. You'll be able to apply them. So if you haven't looked at what Skinner's box is and you're like, what the heck are you talking about, Dr. Dilmar? It's okay. You will need to do that after we go through the lesson tonight so that you can complete the homework for the next time. All right, so we're going to dig into how do we learn. So if you look at this visual, this is the essence of operant conditioning. I'm going to give you a moment to look at this, and then I want to point out something to you that's a shift in thinking. So I'll give you just about 20 seconds. Okay, common concept, right? We want someone to be pleased, we want someone to be polite by saying please. Well, that's how you want a child to respond. And so the consequence of being polite is that you get a treat. And so the child is more likely, or the subject is more likely to be polite in the future because of the promise of getting a treat. But what I'd like to have you pay particular attention to on this visual is the word consequence. So very often, as a layperson or someone who maybe hasn't studied this concept before, we might have a negative connotation when it comes to the words such as consequence. We think as a consequence being negative, but that's not necessarily true when we look at operant conditioning. So there needs to be a shift in your thinking. Sometimes what we already know is dangerous because it might put blinders on to the new learning. So you're going to have to remove some of those, some of that prior knowledge to be open to the new learning. I hope that makes sense to you. If not, remember you can jot down your questions along with your connections, and we will share those at the end. So a consequence can be positive. It's not necessarily negative, or shifting our thinking from the word consequence being a negative. Instead, we're thinking about consequences in this scenario or in this learning concept as the result, right? So what's the result? What's the consequence? Okay, got that down. So now let's look at reinforcement. So there's two types of reinforcement. There's positive reinforcement and there's negative reinforcement. And the examples here will help you see this pretty plainly. I don't think it's too terribly difficult of a concept. And I look at it like a math equation. You're either adding something to the equation or we are removing it. So again, remember when I said with consequence, we have to take our prior knowledge out of the equation and we have to think about this with our new learning. So a consequence is not necessarily positive or negative. It's just the result. Well, when we talk about positive or negative reinforcement, we want to remove the connotation that positive is a good thing and negative is a bad thing. Positive and negative is more along the lines of math than a feeling or that natural sense of positive is good and negative is bad. So take that out of your perspective for a moment and think about positive as adding and negative as taking away, and look at it through the lens of mathematical versus being that subjective feeling of positive is good and negative is bad. And so these examples should be fairly familiar to you. It talks about petting a dog. You could think about a bark collar. You could think about when, your cars these days say fasten driver seatbelt, fasten driver seatbelt. You want that to stop. And so in order for that to stop, you are going to fasten your seatbelt. So these are a couple examples. We'll look at a few more later, and you'll also have time to share your own examples. But let's look at punishment for a moment. And again, positive and negative punishment, not being good punishment, bad punishment, but being adding a punishment or taking away a punishment. That's the perspective or the lens. And so in this case, no one wants a traffic ticket, right? Or you get positive punishment. So who knew that getting a traffic ticket could be positive? This is probably the only time those words will be in the same sentence together. But for the purposes of operant conditioning, the positive punishment is that we're adding something to the equation. That means you're getting the traffic ticket. In the opposite example, something is being taken away. So can you imagine if a cell phone is taken away? And so you're withdrawing or you're removing that, and that's the negative punishment. So I'll give you just a moment to review this. And then I want to go back to reinforcers. So we have our reinforcers, positive and negative. And again, many of you looked at this last night because this is your prep work for the lesson today. And then we have positive and negative punishment. So I want you to take a few minutes and I want you to jot down when have you experienced this in the past or recently? So either currently or in the past, when have you experienced reinforcement or punishment? And I'll set a timer. Let's set a timer for 3 minutes on this. And if you don't have these words in front of you, I'll flip back and forth a couple of times so that you can go back through reinforcement and punishment. And we're going to make some connections to when you've experienced this in the past. All right, I will start that timer now.